Okay, now that we've finished Reconstruction, it's time to finish the rest of Unit 2, which is to look at westward expansion. One of the things that is really tricky for some people to figure out, and I sometimes wonder why that is, but something that's really tricky for some people to figure out is that while Reconstruction is happening in the East, westward expansion is happening in the West. It's happening simultaneously. So while the country is fixing itself from the destruction of the Civil War, we're also seeing a mass migration of people westward. And that is just difficult for some people to realize that it's happening simultaneously in history. And one of the things that we'll look at is that the Civil War and Reconstruction are one of the reasons why this westward expansion occurs. In fact, this goes back during the Civil War. The Homestead Act, one of the things that we're going to look at, and one of the most important things in driving westward expansion, was actually passed as a law in 1862, which means that it happened early in the war, um, which I guess also shows that the North had so much more in terms of resources. It proves that they were actually passing laws and people were moving to the West in the midst of this deadliest of all American wars. The South had to pour everything they had into the conflict and still lost, whereas the Union they're sending people out to you know pioneer and go to the frontier, and they're doing just fine with that. So while the Civil War and Reconstruction are happening in the East, this movement west is also occurring. So that's the first thing to wrap your head around. The other thing that we're going to cover here today, and in general, the big idea is that if we're talking about people moving west, there's got to be more to it than just a move like we would make today. This is a bigger shift than moving in the United States today. So we first need to understand why people would do that.
Oh, give me a home where the
Okay,
buffalo
let's talk about push-pull factors. Um, the move we're talking about here with westward expansion is not like a move that we would make today. Um, Not to say that a move is could not is not an impactful event, but a couple of years ago, my brother moved to Texas, and it wasn't something where I was nervous that he was going to lose his life on the trip or he was risking all everything in going to Texas. It was also something where I knew that I was still going to see him several times a year, with us traveling down there and him coming up here for various reasons. And I could contact him at a moment's notice anytime. It was going to be a big change for him, but not something where I was really like worried about, are we ever going to see each other again? And that's what we need to understand, especially in the early days of this westward expansion and before the railroads were, a fully developed network in the West. There's a kind of a feeling that you're risking life and limb in doing this. You're going out and living on the frontier where the you're really in a lot of cases taking your life in your hands. uh, Several times as we talk over the next couple of days, I'll probably talk about Little House on the Prairie, the Little House series of books by Laura Ingalls Wilder. And it was made into a TV show. It's pretty well known as, it was on TV for a decade. And in one of the early books, her family moves from Wisconsin territory into Kansas. And it's interesting in that book is that idea, and it comes through with everything they're talking about. They know that there's a very good chance that they're never going to see grandma again, and there's kind of this feeling that, what, this could be it. So we need to understand that this is a major decision you're risking everything and possibly leaving your family behind and your friends behind forever. Um, so we need to kind of figure out, why is it that people would take that kind of chance? And sociologists have studied this, and they've come to put these reasons into what they call push-pull factors. If you're going to risk it all and leave everything behind, there's going to be a combination of reasons to do that for most people, on average. And so what we need to look at are the push factors. Those are things that are wrong where you are. These are reasons why you would want to leave your current conditions. If it ain't broke, don't fix it is, an accurate description here, because for a lot of people, it's not going to be worth it. Why risk everything if everything is going just great here? Of course, there's always some people that are, looking to the horizon. But for the majority of people, if things aren't bad where they are, why go? So the first thing is those push factors, something that is broken where you are. And then the pull factors are those things that make the new place seem all that much more attractive. There's if you look across the fence and it looks as bad or worse than where you are, why go? So we also need to look at, what are those things that made the West attractive? Why would people risk it all and potentially, leave everybody and everything they know behind, never to possibly see them again? So those are pull factors, push factors and pull factors. If, generally speaking, for the average person, if both of those aren't there, they're not making this kind of life altering change. There's got to be something that makes you say, this is not right here. I don't want to be here anymore. There's something wrong here. But then there also has to be, I look to the horizon and I see something better over here. And so you've got to have those two together for people to make this kind of move and this kind of life altering change.
Where the buffalo roam, where the deer and
Okay, so let's look at 4 push factors. There's obviously more than 4, depending on people's individual circumstances, but when taken together, these are 4 that are common in the thousands of people that are going to be headed west. First, the Civil War. For a lot of people, there isn't a whole lot tying them to home, because it's possible that home doesn't exist anymore, especially throughout the South. Think about what happened, the way that William Tecumseh Sherman's able to defeat the Confederates with his move across, his march across Georgia, and what he's done to the city of Atlanta. That's happened all throughout the South. There's devastation throughout the South as whole cities, farms, plantations have been burned to the ground. I think of a tour that I once took in a little town called Franklin, which is now a suburb of Nashville. There was a major Civil War battle around Franklin, and a few years ago, some people with like CSI type of equipment went in, even 150 years removed, with the ability to detect traces of blood. And this one farmhouse had been used as a field hospital. And when they went in there with some sort of black light kind of technology, the whole house glowed. There was blood everywhere from what they used this place for as a field hospital. Doors were taken off and used as beds, and it was amazing. Amazing in that they were startled just how prevalent this was. Well, can you imagine being the owner of that home? That might be the kind of thing that you could never, ever set foot in that place again. So there are thousands of stories like that throughout the South and the North, where people are, you know, going to have everything taken from them by the war. So why not leave? Next, farmland. The cost of farmland in the East is relatively expensive. I'm not saying that it was, you know, compared to maybe what it is now or what it was in other places in the world, but relatively for the United States, farmland was getting expensive in the East. Now, why does that matter? Something we need to understand. When I talk about farmers at this point in American history, I'm talking about a majority of Americans. You know, today farmers make up 2% of the population, roughly. But at this time, this was more Americans were farmers than not. So if you're talking about something that impacts farmers, you're talking about something that impacts a majority of Americans. And so the issue in the East is that you've had settlement there for several hundred years by this point. And as successive generations have grown, as immigrants have come in, as natural population growth has occurred, you're getting more and more farmers on the same amount of land. Um, and the idea at that time was generally that the oldest son was going to inherit the farm. And so if you were one of the younger kids, you were going to need to find your own place. And it was becoming increasingly difficult to find land that hadn't been settled in the East. And that was driving up the price. You had more people trying to buy farmland, which makes it more expensive. Well, this, especially when you combine this with some other things that we'll talk about with pull factors, is going to make it really attractive for people to go west. You know, for instance, my dad is from an old-fashioned farm family. He was raised on the farm. He's one of 12. And so my dad is the ninth of 12 kids. He would have never inherited the farm. He would have had to go and try and find a new place to farm. Um, Another reason why people are going to flee the East is to escape racism and discrimination. The West is not perfect, but one of the things that we will talk about is that racism and discrimination were less on the frontier. And we'll get into this in greater detail later, but the idea was life on the frontier was difficult enough that you didn't have enough time left in your day to be discriminatory, to be racist, to be prejudiced. If you're a freed slave, hitting the road and getting out of the South is a very attractive idea. You know, getting out of this place where you've been held in bondage and everything you've ever known is slavery. Now, we know that there are a majority of slaves that don't leave, but some do. And it was, you know, that there's going to be a sizable population of former slaves that hit the road. You see, there's exodusters. That's a play on words. The West, as we studied the first week of school, is rather dry. Exodus is the biblical story of the people of the Jewish faith escaping their slavery in Egypt. So you put those together, you got Exodus, this escape from slavery, and dry, dusty exodusters. So that was a term that was used to describe those freed slaves that went west. Another story along those lines are people of the Mormon faith, the Latter-day Saints. They were chased throughout the East, different states that, you know, as a faith, it begins in New York, and they head west as they're driven out of New York as outsiders that people were scared of, because it's kind of a human nature thing where people, if you're different, we don't like you. So they left New York. They actually come to Missouri, and at a time it looked like they were going to build the center of their church in Jackson County, Missouri, until the state of Missouri essentially treated them like you would treat a wolf population or coyotes or something like that, where it was essentially okay to kill Mormons. The state of Missouri, for all intents and purposes, declared war on the Mormon faith. And it wasn't until the 1970s that the governor actually kind of apologized for that whole thing. So that's how serious it was. More than 100 years later, the state of Missouri apologizes for what they've done. So the Mormon faith moves from Missouri to Illinois, and there the leader, Joseph Smith, is killed by a mob. So they just get. And one of the things that, they go to Utah, around Salt Lake City, out in the middle of the desert, where nobody's going to bother them. So that opportunity to escape racism and discrimination and death at the hands of that racism and discrimination was a powerful push factor. And like a lot of people, anytime there's that desire for a fresh start, and three of the most famous names in the West, I like to point out here, and for those of you who are still looking for things to do for self-assigned points, I cannot more strongly recommend the movie Tombstone and the movie Wyatt Earp. Okay? Remember, you can watch movies for self-assigned points. Just a great story. Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday are famous for the shootout at the OK Corral, the famous showdown with the Cowboys. There wasn't a whole lot of those kinds of, showdowns where you meet in the street and shoot at one another. That's kind of the creation of Hollywood to a certain degree. But this is actually one that really did happen. The shootout at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona. Doc Holliday was a doc because he was a dentist. Was raised in Georgia and came down with a case of tuberculosis. With the consumption, it attacks the lungs. So if you've ever seen any movie representation of Doc Holliday, he's always coughing blood into a handkerchief, which is actually something that happened to the people that have consumption tuberculosis. That obviously is going to kill his dentist career. Anybody want to go to a dentist that's coughing up blood on you? And it's a death sentence. It's just a question of how long it would take the tuberculosis to kill you. So he decides, I'm going to go out in a blaze of glory. So he goes out west and is a gambler, hard drinker, gets into all kinds of different scrapes, and he manages somehow to survive them all, which is kind of the shocking end to his story. He's basically going out and trying to commit suicide by gunfight, and he survives all of them, only to die in a hospital bed in Colorado. He survives the shootout at the OK Corral. His best friend in the entire world, Wyatt Earp, famous lawman, he gains fame as a lawman in Kansas cow towns, which was no mean feat, because imagine being a lawman in one of those Kansas cow towns. When cowboys come into town, they haven't had any money and they haven't seen anybody in months, and they suddenly have money in their pocket, and they have a bunch of other cowboys that are armed to the teeth around, and then you throw the fact that there's some ladies into the mix for them to compete for the interests of, and being a lawman with that kind of witch's brew is a dangerous place to be. But he actually became a lawman because he was on the run from the law himself. He had stolen a horse. His wife had died, and by all accounts, Wyatt dealt with that like a lot of people did, by climbing into a whiskey bottle, and was drunk for an extended period of time. And on his downward spiral, he had stolen a horse. And his judge father had managed to get him out on bail and told Wyatt, just run, go, because stealing a horse was a possible capital offense at that time. So he just disappears off of the historical radar for a while until he shows up as a Kansas lawman, which basically the only qualification you had to have for that was you had to be crazy enough to take the job. So he did, and writes his name into history. And then the last example I have is Billy the Kid, who is famous for another movie that you can watch for self-assigned points, Young Guns. There's lots of Westerns, so there's no shortage of Westerns that you can watch for self-assigned points, but there's three that I recommend. Is famous for his participation in something that's called the Lincoln County War in New Mexico. Billy's family life in the East was not great. One of the reasons why he's Billy the Kid is Billy wasn't sure what his last name was. Mom wasn't able to tell him that. He's actually from New Jersey, which is kind of a surprise. You think of Billy the Kid as being this Western figure, but he's born and raised in New Jersey. And so he escapes essentially to New Mexico, where he is quasi adopted by this ranch owner, John Tunstall. And John Tunstall is killed by a rival ranch owner. And Billy takes upon himself to try and even the score, and then goes on this murderous rampage that ultimately ends with his own death at the hands of the lawman Pat Garrett. And again, if you're interested in knowing more of that story, you can check out the movie Young Guns.
Where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. Home, home on the range, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not.
Okay, so let's look at four pull factors. So you've got push factors, those things that drive people out from where they are, things that are wrong about home, and then pull factors, those things that are, hey, it looks great over there, let's go see what that's about. So let's look at this. The first pull factor, the Pacific Railway Acts. One of the reasons why the West became more attractive was that in the midst of all of this, it became easier to go west physically. You know, that this wasn't the case for everybody. There's still going to be a lot of people that can't afford this, or taking a lot of stuff, or they're going to a place where there's no railroad tracks yet. So there's going to still be thousands of people that are going to head west on wagons. But one of the things that makes it a little bit more attractive to move west is that you might not be leaving everything behind. The Pacific Railway Acts were designed to help trains build track out west. That was the big issue. You're talking about, millions of square miles of unoccupied land. If I'm in the railroad business, that's not where I'm building track. There's nobody there to bring service to. So I'm not going to make money building track out in the middle of nowhere. But you also run into the issue of the government owns all this land that they want to have productive and have citizens on that are paying taxes. And, why they purchase the land is to have it available to their citizens. So how can you get them to move out there? It becomes a chicken and the egg situation, which is going to come first. You're not going to build trains where there aren't people, but people are reluctant to go where they're out in the middle of nowhere with no connection to society. And so the decision is to kind of jumpstart this by making it more attractive for railroad companies to build track. And the idea is to give the railroad companies a subsidy. A subsidy is something that you give a corporation to, it's money. It's something you give them to help their business. Now, the government doesn't have a whole lot of money during the Civil War and right after, but one thing, the United States government is cash poor, but land rich. They do have lots of land, which is a capital resource. How about converting that into cash? So what they do is the government, with the Pacific Railway Acts, deeds land to the railroad companies for them to sell to raise money to build track. So the government is helping the tracks be built by giving the subsidy in the form of land. The railroad companies then would sell that land to settlers, take the money, build track. If you put all of the land together, if you look at that map in your notes, if you put all of that land together, it would equal the state of Texas. That's how much land was given to the railroad companies. Now, one of the things you might be thinking about here, because one of my future slides is going to talk about how you could essentially get free land from the government. Why would anybody buy land from the railroad companies if you could get it for free? Well, proximity to the railroads. That's the big attraction of there. You might be able to get land free somewhere else, and you could, but if I pay a little bit, I can be close to the railroad tracks and have an easier connection to the outside world. This works like a charm. The first transcontinental railroad, that first line connecting the country from coast to coast, is going to be finished in 1869. So this was a huge pull factor. Another pull factor was same sort of situation, the Morrill Land Grant Act. Again, this is kind of a subsidy, but in this case, the land was given to the states. And the purpose here was for them to build colleges, to build universities. And that's a pull factor in that it was twofold. One, I'm a parent. I want my kids to have a better life than I have. If you're any kind of parent, that's what you wish. And so this is a pull factor in that, I'm going to be going out there, and these state-owned schools are going to be subsidized by the government. It might be the kind of education that I can afford to send my kids to college. So that's a huge pull factor. That's something that's going to be available to my kids. But also these land grant universities, part of their job, the reason that they exist, the reason they get this subsidy from the government is to help the people that live there. Particularly, this is aimed at farmers, which again is a majority of Americans at this time. The land grant universities have a responsibility to research and develop and then disseminate different and better forms of farming, which is still a job of a land grant university. The University of Missouri has what's called extension offices all over the state. The closest one is in Hillsboro. And Mrs. Jung, who you see for National History Day, is actually on the Extension Council. She's part of this system. So the land grant universities are designed to help the people that live there, have an easier time of farming. A lot of these land grant universities were called A&Ms. Now, the most famous one that hasn't changed its name is Texas A&M. The A&M stands for Agricultural and Mechanical. It is a land grant university whose job it was to develop new farming techniques and then spread those to the people of Texas where they are. So the Morrill Land Grant Act, you give land to the states, they sell the land, take the money, build a college. And then part of that promise is that they will then develop and research better farming techniques. My alma mater, the University of Missouri, is a land grant university. It started before the Morrill Land Grant Act was passed. It started in 1839, but it becomes a land grant university. It has access to those funds and adds what it needs to add to become a land grant university. So today it's a land grant university. And just while I'm talking about it, you see the columns at the back of the room. That's a picture there of the columns at Mizzou. If you've ever wondered why there are columns, and you probably have seen pictures of it, it's one of the most photographed places in the state, after the Arch and the Capitol building, is that the main building at Mizzou, and there's some pictures in your notes there of the main building burning down. It burned down in 1892, and they were going to tear down the whole building, but the students decided that they had this connection to the main building there at the University of Missouri, and were able to convince the administrators to save the columns. So the rest of the building is cleared away, and they save the columns. If you've ever been to the columns, or if you ever get a chance to go to the columns, if you go to the side that's in between the columns and that big building behind it, Jesse Hall, you can actually see the fire damage. You can see where it's cracked and broken from the fire damage. So just a footnote there. If you see my columns at the back of the room, and they're called the columns, not the pillars or anything else. The zoo people call them the columns, just FYI. So if you call them anything else, I'm gonna wig out on you. All right. The next pull factor is the Homestead Act. Free land, as it were. This is obviously going to be something that's going to bring people not only from the East, but from all over the world. This is going to be in newspapers everywhere that the United States as a country is so rich that they're giving away land, 160 acres for free. Now, you did have to pay a small registration fee, but it was nominal. You just had like a filing fee with your paperwork. 160 acres of land. You had to meet 5 conditions. You had to be 21 or the head of the household. You had to be a citizen or in the process of becoming one. So that's why it was open to anybody all over the world. You didn't have to actually be a citizen yet. You could just, start. You're going to be a citizen and you could participate in this. You had to build a house. You had to live in the house 6 months out of the year. And you had to farm and improve the land for 5 years. If you met those 5 conditions, you were given title to 160 acres free of charge. You earned it with what today we would call sweat equity. You didn't put money into it, you put sweat into it. You earned the title by working it. Just as an FYI, it's found out later on that in certain parts of the West, 160 acres is not enough to make a farm go. Not everybody that homesteaded is successful with this. In places where it's really, really dry, you can't grow enough, or whether it be wheat or cattle or whatever, to make the farm profitable, to make it go. So it's not going to be something where it's a success story for everybody, but there are thousands of people that are successful in doing this, and it's going to be obviously something that is going to pull people from the East and from all over the world the chance for free land. 1862, too, and that's the middle of the Civil War that's done, which is always pretty amazing to me that while the United States is fighting the Civil War, they're also, focused on expanding to the West. And the final pull factor is true in the West, but it's true anywhere. The United States, we believe in the concept of private property. This is mine, that's yours. I could put a lock on this stuff. It's mine. And the idea there is that the government would protect your property rights. Now, one of the reasons why I point this one out in particular is that when we look at conflicts with Native American tribes, they have a completely different concept of property ownership. It's not private property, it's communal property. And so that idea of, I own this is mine, that's yours, you stay over there, let's build a fence, is not held in most Native American tribes. They have more of the idea that, hey, we all own this, all of it together. And if you think about that for a second, those two ideas do not play nice with one another. And so that's one of the reasons why there is going to be huge clashes over property in the West during westward expansion between the American settlers and the Native Americans that were there.
Where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. Home, home on the range, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. heaven are bright with the light of the glittering stars. I stood there amazed, and I asked as I gazed if their glory existed around. Home, home on the range, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not